Hey everybody, it's Scott Leckie from Democracy Tomorrow. There's many ways to describe the current world in which we're all co-inhabiting. One would be the battle between democracy and dictatorship. And we don't need to look very far to see the emergence of new dictators. We see aspiring dictators. We see alliances between dictators. Some may not call themselves dictator, but clearly through their actions are doing the things that dictators have always done throughout history. And these are common themes that can be monitored and tracked. And clearly what's happening in the United States today is tending much more in that direction than in the direction of enhanced democracy. There was a time when the United States was truly seen by the world as a force for good, as a force for democracy, as a force for justice in the world. There's a fascinating book here called, which you cannot really see, but called One World by presidential candidate Wendell Willkie, written in the 1940s on the request of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was president from 1932 until 1945. He sent his opposition candidate, the person that ran against him, to travel the world and see what was going on, to try to begin to formulate the structures that would govern the world from the end of the World War II period onwards. And as a result of that, the driving force behind the instrument that just was celebrating its 80th anniversary a few days ago, the United Nations Charter, was derived partially because of this famous trip by Wendell Willkie all around the world. The United States was the driving force behind the United Nations Charter, where so much of international law was developed. Basic principles of do not invade another country, do not take territory by force, do not arbitrarily fire missiles or other weapons into a country unless there's approval by the United Nations Security Council. And the list goes on and on and on. We are now living in an era where, despite the Charter still being the cornerstone of international law, holding the world together, it is being eroded and chipped away at day by day. This is a very tragic development. And at its forefront is, unfortunately, the United States and its lack of interest in complying with an international legal order that it is the primary driver behind. So instead of being the force for good and democracy and greater protection of human rights and so forth, it doesn't take very much deep analysis to see what's occurring right now in the United States and in terms of its foreign policy. And yet, there are still millions upon millions of Americans outside the country, but particularly inside the country, who have a whole different view, who hold on to that positive vision that the United States was once the leader of at the international level, who believe not only in greater protection of human rights and greater international justice, but even more deeply, as we do at Democracy Tomorrow, in the idea of world citizenship, the idea that we are all equal co-inhabitants of the very same planet, and that only in us all recognizing this can we finally achieve the planet that we all know is possible and that we all deserve, but which we have still very, very, very great distances to travel before we actually reach there. Today, we have a very special guest speaking to us from Portland, Oregon, director extraordinaire Skye Fitzgerald, who I think would probably, in all likelihood, classify himself as a world citizen. And we're here today to talk about his life as a feature documentary filmmaker, his travels around the world, and his hopes and fears for the country in which he finds himself today. So, Skye Fitzgerald, welcome to Democracy Tomorrow. It's really great to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Scott. It's really a pleasure to talk to you as always. You as a former American, I find I always learn something in all of our conversations, and I'm sure I'm going to learn a lot here.
Well, what's it like now to, let's put it like this, did you ever think that the United States that you grew up in and where you still reside would reach the point that it has reached today in terms of political instability, human rights crimes, go it alone, America first attitude. Did you think that would ever really happen? I mean, it's always a threat, but it seems to be happening pretty quickly.
Yeah, it does seem like things are changing quickly here. Um, but I wanna back up just a little bit because of this notion of global citizenry that we first talked about so many months ago, probably well over a year ago. It for me it sort of codified so many things in terms of a lot of the work that I've done in the past, and it reminded me of a quote that I've used over the years sometimes when I think about global citizenry writ large, and it's a quote by Sterling Hayden. Or do you remember Sterling Hayden? He was a sort of adventurer, writer, but he once wrote, you know, well, what does a person really need? You know, a few pounds of food every day, heat and shelter, 6 feet to lie down in, and some sort of working activity that yields a sense of accomplishment. And I don't even remember which of his books that comes out of at this point, but it's stuck with me over the years, and to me, you know, that sort of way of thinking, that universality that is inherent in that statement really resonates with me, right? Because it immediately sort of distills down what we as human beings need fundamentally, right? To live on this planet, regardless of national borders, regardless of societal class, economics, color of our skin, language, religion, sexual orientation. We all really need the same things, right? And yet I think so many of the things that our governments put into place, that our own cultures put into place, work against that, right? And work force us to sort of identify our differences rather than our commonalities. And I fight that all the time in my work and in my daily life. And that's what appeals to me in what you're trying to do here is I feel like that's a shared principle that you live each and every day in your life.
Yeah, very much so. And, I guess, part of the frustration of having the worldview that, we both have, and I believe hundreds of millions of people also have, is, you know, how do we encourage people who don't embrace this idea of we are all the same, we are all equal, we have the same needs and wants and really deserve the same treatment and respect? How do we get the people that are not there yet closer to that finish line? Because I know for you and me, we have both traveled very far and wide across the world, pretty much everywhere. And, as I always reiterate, and as you have certainly seen, and we'll talk about your films shortly, you know, the suffering of a mother in Yemen is no different than the suffering of a woman from Oklahoma City, and the suffering of a woman, at the hands of an abuser in wherever, Brazil is the same as it is in Botswana. And the hunger that people feel in a certain place is the very same feeling everywhere. And we have seen it time and time again. And, certainly for me, probably for you, as life goes on, the more we meet people, the more places we go, the more people we see, these feelings of commonality are entrenched deeper and deeper. The concept of even there being an other, of there being us versus them, of being, the existence of a them is kind of, in my mind, it doesn't really even exist, you know? Yes, we see states which are derived exactly as you said, based on difference rather than commonality, and and religions as well, and all of the things that are so-called identities and belief structures. It's all based on us versus them and difference. And I think, to me, that's one of the ways forward to try to transcend that idea of difference and other, and just look at the shared characteristics, because we so easily forget these really fundamental basic things.
Yeah, yeah, exactly right. I often say, there's no such thing as a Yemeni child or an American child or a Palestinian child or an Israeli child. There's just a child,
Right,
right? And I
right.
think that's the lens through which I choose to see the world, is that this is a child. and they have the same fundamental needs as any child any other place in the world. I can't answer your larger question because that would go to folks with far greater pay grades than myself. But I will say, speaking as an American, I because I still am an American, and I want to talk about why you aren't somewhere in this conversation, Scott, because I find that fascinating. But for me, I've thought a lot over the years, like, what do we need to do in America, right, to start working on this issue of the other, right? And I over the years, I've come up with a number of things that if I had a magic wand and I could wave it, I would wave it, and it would involve three things. One would be media literacy, like building robust media literacy into our public education system from a very young age, so that kids from first grade, third grade, fourth grade on, right, they can distinguish fact from fiction, false from true, how to determine what an original source is, right? How to determine what a fact is, right? How to get multiple sources for verification, because that level of media literacy doesn't exist in our educational system right now, writ large. Some places it does, but it's not built into our system. And I think if we did that, we'd be building a generation that knows how to determine what is true and what's not, and that would deeply affect the next generation of folk in our country. The second thing that I've always, and this comes out of my own experience, and then because I lived abroad as a 17-year-old, and I know you left so I went to school in Sweden for a year as a 16, 17-year-old, and that completely changed my life. So I think if we could wave that magic wand and ensure that every single high school student had to go abroad for a month in order to receive their high school diploma, right? Where they have like a month in a school in another country. I think it would completely transform the American psyche over the course of a generation in a positive way, where we would have more empathy, we'd have more understanding, we wouldn't be looking just through this singular lens of exceptionalism, right? That so often happens. And the third thing I do with that magic wand is I would put into place a law so that every single federally elected official, before they're sworn in, right, they have to travel abroad, right, and visit at least a handful of US government funded programs outside of the United States, so they can firsthand see and understand the place that our government has in the rest of the world, like within the aid system, for example. Because if you don't see that with your own eyes, you can't understand it fully, right? And you're more likely to be influenced by third party influencers who have political agendas, right? So those would be the three things, right? The media literacy, the high school student having to go abroad, and third, elected officials having to go abroad as well. And I think that would make us a more empathetic nation.
Well, I'll add a fourth one to that list, that any U.S. official and any student has to be given a blank map of the world with the countries' names missing, and they have
Oh,
to fill them all in, right?
interesting.
Because when I've taught law school at many different schools, and well, I won't even name the school, so it's too embarrassing. But it's a good law school in the United States,
Yeah.
and they had a summer program in Geneva, so there's a clue, with all American students, and I taught there many summers. And the first thing I would do to the American law students, this is cream of the crop people. This is high, smart, well studied, high grade people, going to be the future lawyers of America. I said, hey guys, first thing we're doing in this class is doing a test. We're doing a test. And they're like, no way, we can't have a test. I said, don't worry, it doesn't count on your grade. It's just, fun thing. So I would hand out a blank map of the world with 12 countries highlighted. No, 10 countries highlighted. And I didn't choose Equatorial Guinea. I didn't choose Sao Tome and Principe. I didn't choose St. Kitts and Nevis, right? I chose France, Canada, Russia, big ones, right? And so I did this for probably 8 or 10 summers, right? And I collected all of them at the end, and it was like several hundred papers thick. It was like a whole ream of paper. And I went through all of them, and the average correct answers was less than 2, right?
Oh, God.
These are U.S. law students, right? So, and I don't want to make fun of anybody, but the bottom line is you at least have to understand a modicum of demographics to understand the nature of global politics. Who's neighbor with whom? Who invaded whom 200 years ago? Who trades with whom, et cetera, et cetera. And so I would add that to the list. But at least you got to know the geography of our one single solitary planet. But I think the idea of there's many countries have had or still have some degree of a national service program. Where you have to do the military or some other thing. If you don't want to do military, you have to do some sort of social service for 6 months or a year. Doing something like that in the United States, fully funded by the government, by the way, so everybody could participate. And yeah, indeed, even just a month would fundamentally change. Most Americans never travel internationally. It doesn't even enter their mind.
I would add language to that public
Yes,
education piece
indeed,
too.
indeed. And that's also
at
kind
the
of
youngest age, right? At the youngest age.
start it at kindergarten. You have to choose one of three, whatever it may be. But and even that, I'm lucky enough to speak several languages, like 4. And for an American, that's a lot. Not compared to a lot of my other friends who can speak 6 or 8 or 10 languages, European friends and others, Indian friends. But it also changes your mind because you see how language fits together, and you feel it. You feel
cultural, right? Language is cultural. Yeah.
Totally cultural. And the difference between, I can speak German and Spanish, right? And Dutch. Dutch I speak almost like English. I don't even think about it. And I dream in Dutch and I read books in Dutch. So that's kind of different. But German is a little bit less, and Spanish is about the same level as German. But the feeling I get when I speak Spanish with Spanish-speaking friends, obviously, and German with German-speaking friends, totally different feeling, And it just broadens your horizons. It expands your awareness. And so I think that would be excellent. But this whole idea of, one of the things that shocks people from outside, remembering the United States is less than 5% of the world population. 1 out of 20 humans alive is American. 19 out of 20 people alive are not American. Okay, so it's one piece in a bigger puzzle. It's not perceived that way in many places in the United States. It is the only puzzle. And this whole kind of, our nation first, America first, we're the exceptional nation. I mean, they shamelessly say publicly, we are the exceptional nation. But you're not. It's just another country. It's another place where humans live in a particular economic system, in a particular political arrangement. But that's ultimately what it is. But when you have that worldview, obviously you're going to respond to the rest of the world in a different way. And that's why a minority of Americans even have passports. A minority of Americans ever travel overseas, if at all. Mexico and Canada, maybe. Probably not anymore, or less. But to go beyond that is still a relatively, rare thing. And, I always took the position, like you said, I left home when I was 17. I left the country forever when I was 22. It's just, the world's huge, and it's tiny, but at the same time it's huge. And there's just so many things to see, so many people to meet, so many things to encounter and experience that, like America sure has a lot to offer the world, particularly at the national park level and things of that nature, and the cities and so on and so forth. But there is such a big world out there that I can't even imagine having never had these experiences. And you don't, there's this famous American integral philosopher named Ken Wilber always uses this term, this phrase, the map is not the territory. And that was one of the first things I read from him, the map is not the territory. And I'm like, what is that? And that is so true. Because a lot of times people look at the map and they think it's being experienced by them, just like they look at a TV screen or a computer screen and they see a vlogger in cruising around South Africa, and it's like, oh yeah, I've been to South Africa now. Well, you actually haven't, and you got to go, to those places, and it will change you, for the best. I'm completely convinced. There's very, very few people that have come out of their comfort zone and traveled throughout the world, even at countries at the same economic level as the United States, let alone, the poor global South, etc., where you will be changed for the better. There's no doubt about it. Everything will be put into a new perspective because of the place you just went to, and then you go to the next place and it will be put in yet another perspective, every time deeper, every time more, diverse, and just increases your understanding of the human condition. So maybe that's a good segue point to start talking about some of the amazing films that you have made and won accolades for and Oscar nominations and everything else. So, I mean, you've done films in Yemen, you've done films in North Africa and Southern Europe, you've done films, I can see the poster behind you, one of your first well-known films, 50 Feet from Syria. So let's talk about that one first. What was that film all about?
Yeah, 50 Feet from Syria was so because I'm a global citizen, right? I follow global events, but I also experience them sometimes in country, of course, as well. But so I was when the uprising began in Syria, I was following it pretty avidly, and right about that time, I was racing bicycles a little bit on the weekends and stuff, and I had an accident and broke my hand where this guy cut in front of me and I flipped over the handlebars and did a somersault and landed my hand at full speed, right? And broke part of it. So I went and saw a specialist and, he looked at my hand and within, minutes said you need surgery. But somehow we got on the conversation of politics in Syria, and he was Syrian American, and he happened to be a Syrian American surgeon who had left his country at 18, gone to medical school in the United States, and then was part of the diaspora. And we just started talking about the developments in Syria and got pretty animated conversation. And he pulled the curtain around us so he couldn't get any more patients. And we talked for like a half hour, right? Even though he'd already done the diagnosis. And at the end of this, I gave him my card and I said, listen, if you ever decide to go back, shoot me an email. And a number of months went by and I got an email from him. And this wonderful human being, Hisham Bismar, who's just a gem of a human being writ large, fantastic surgeon, but just a great human, started to act as a volunteer surgeon on the border region between Turkey and Syria. And he was going to this town called Rahanli on the border. And it was, at the time, it was the only functioning hospital, surgical center that was approved by the Turkish government to treat Syrian refugees. So they would come across the border from the war, be treated in this one center right on the border, and then many of them would then return back into Syria. And the Turkish authorities allowed them to come over the border to do that because they were victims of war, right? Hisham, as an orthopedic surgeon, was doing really complicated surgeries, right? Because there were fractures and amputations and tendon reattachments. And so we talked for a while, and then ultimately myself and the DP, Kenny Allen, flew back and just lived in this hotel in the only room that was available in this town for 3 weeks or so, and shot this film and then came back. And that was 50 Feet from Syria. That was pretty well received. Netflix ended up picking it up.
And that was about what was that right at the beginning of the uprising, 2011, 12?
Years in, so that was 2014, actually. It had been going on for 2.5 years or so.
Right.
Yeah.
And look what's happened to Syria now.
Whew, so much has happened. Yeah. Isham just came to a screening. We did a screening of a trilogy of my films a month or so ago, and he still lives here in Portland, and he came to the screening. It was good to catch up with him.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Because I mean, what a transformation that country has gone through.
Yeah,
I mean,
exciting stuff.
And it's not. I was writing to all my Syrian friends when Assad fled the country and the revolution succeeded, etc., saying, "Come on, man, you can be the next Sweden, guys. Come on." And they're like, "Well, we'll improve, but I don't know if we'll reach Sweden levels." But there was so much hope and everything, and now it's kind of flattening out. The hopefulness, and I mean, Israel's been bombing them routinely, occupying parts of the country. The government is, very insecure. The economic situation is appalling. There's all sorts of goodwill, but it's you, and this is a good, happy reminder of the problems of having a dictatorship in a country. And allowing one to emerge as the Assad family did. These dynastic regimes built of families over generations, in the end, always fail, universally bring their country into absolute disrepute, and it takes decades or longer to recover from the consequences of one family ruling a country with an iron fist, with so much brutality, so much carnage, against some of the most educated, sophisticated, erudite, kind, gentle, generous people you could ever meet, which is, I'm sure, something that doesn't come across the minds of most Americans when you mention Syria, let alone Palestine.
That's their tradition going back centuries, right?
Absolutely.
Always,
Absolutely.
I mean, the most educated in that part of the world, right? That society. And so, and I'd like to just mention hope in this arena of talk, because you're right, there's been so much hope in the last handful of months surrounding Syria. A couple friends of mine who are Syrian, Talal Durkee, who's done Fathers and Sons, many famous films that have been nominated for Oscars, and then he went back, and so we dialogued a little bit before he went back because he was going back with a very small team. And then Jay Abdo, who was one of the most famous television actors in the country and had to flee around 2011 as well. He returned as well, and they both returned with incredible trances of hope. Right, this sense of this can be something that we rebuild now. That can be better than it's been for generations. And I don't think that hope has been extinguished, Scott. I think it lives on despite all the current challenges.
For sure. And I mean, they are essentially, well, you can't erase a whatever 5,000-year history, but a lot has been erased, particularly in the last 10, 15 years, certainly at a physical level. The 7 to 10 million, what is it, 12 million refugees? I can't even remember how many refugees or IDPs. Millions upon millions of people not only were forced to flee, but actually saw their houses fully and completely destroyed. So to say they have returned is only partially true, because they can't even go back to where they were once living, right? For the most part, because the physical buildings don't even exist anymore. So it's really starting from scratch in many ways, and that's another reminder of, I've worked in countless post-conflict societies, post-dictatorial societies, and if I have one lesson to impart, is that you have to use the bad time when the dictator's in power to plan for the good time, because the good time will come. You just don't know when it will come. But if you don't plan accordingly, you don't have anything to work from once you finally have a semblance of a democracy emerging again. And so use the bad time now to plan for the good time later. And that's what I've often tried to do the last 15 or 20 years with different movements around the world. It's like, do you even know what the housing, land, and property rights laws are in your country, so that when you come back and you do take power eventually, what are you going to do? What's your constitution going to look like? How are you going to structure it? Where are you going to put investments first? All those kind of questions. And it's hard, but it's very hard to have those hopeful thoughts when you see what a dictatorship is doing to a country,
And when people are being murdered and you don't have fresh water and there's not enough food,
Totally. But it takes sometimes outsiders who are in a fortunate position to work together with those who are still in the midst of the suffering to push it on. And, as we've been saying already, this entire conversation, it doesn't matter where the people come from. It doesn't matter what their religion is or their history or anything else. They're people. And I can guarantee you're going to see exactly the same sentiments from people wherever you go in the world. They might look different, they might believe different things, but at their core, they're the same. So you have received 2 Academy Award nominations for 2 of your films. The first of those, I think I got these in the right order, was Lifeboat, correct? So tell us about Lifeboat, because that is an amazing film. I've of course seen it. I've watched it like many times. And one of the things, I'm a like an amateur film buff, unlike you. I try to prove my credentials, but I watch at least one movie a day, sometimes two or three, usually on the bike. And the thing that struck me most, I would first of all encourage everybody to find Lifeboat and other films that Skye has made and watch them. But the thing that really stuck in my head, having watched thousands of documentaries before, of course, and made some, is how close you were able to get. I mean, there was a palpable sense of proximity that I had rarely seen in the documentary before. And so maybe talk about that, because I mean, you were basically going out on the boats where refugees were fleeing northern Africa, trying to get into Europe, and filming so close that you could really see the human tragedy that was unfolding.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one of the tenets that I live by as a documentary filmmaker is original sourcing, right? Like that it's I would call it almost it's a principle certainly that I follow. But there's lots of genres of documentary filmmaking that don't leverage that principle, right? It's a biodoc, it's an archive doc, right? It relies upon other animations or other tools to tell the narrative story, especially in humanitarian cinema. I believe it's absolutely critical to not rely upon anything but original sourcing as much as possible. And what I mean by that is the camera should be there, right? Because if it's second sourcing or third sourcing, and this goes all the way back to, research methods in grad school, right? You're taught, it's hammered into your brain if it was a good professor, that original sourcing is king, right? And I believe that. And I believe it especially so in cinema where things are unfolding in real time, right? So that was one of the principles that I brought into Lifeboat is I thought if I'm going to cover sort of this incredible humanitarian disaster which is unfolding in real time, I'm not going to rely upon newscasters. I'm not going to rely upon archive footage. Instead, what I wanted to do was to try to create as visceral a piece as possible by being there in the moment. And we did that by developing a relationship with one of the rescue operators who was actually actively committed to pulling people out of the ocean. And that's what we did. And we did it using that principle of original source material. And I think for me that's the victory of the film in some ways, is that we were able to do that. Now there were a lot of pieces to that, right? And part of that is that eh, another principle that I've come to over the years is just this notion, and this I think you'll appreciate this from having worked over the world, Scott, is just that I personally believe that you have to be a human being first and a filmmaker second. And that doesn't align fully with everyone who works in documentaries. Like one of my heroes, Frederick Wiseman, who has done 50, 60, 70 films more. I grew up watching things like, not grew up, but in college when I started to become attracted to doing films, he became one of my heroes. He did films like Titicut Follies, where he's incredible verite work. He's known as the father of verite cinema, right? And I watched a talk that he did years ago, and it was quite fascinating because here's my hero up on the stage, and this is around the time I did Lifeboat, and he showed some clips from a film that he did. I forget which one it was, but he was covering a police department in the 60s. And he showed a clip of basically police abuse, right? Where they were abusing this prostitute, this sex worker. And he just rolled on it. And he showed that clip up on stage. And he talked about his premise, his belief that the way he always wanted to do documentaries was fly on the wall, pure verite, direct cinema. You don't intervene ever. You simply witness. You don't shape the scene, right? And while I sat there and listened to my hero, one of my heroes talk, um, you know, I realized that for one of the first times in my career, I deeply disagreed with him because I'd had my own experiences with Lifeboat, for example. This is, I think, right after I shot it, where we found ourselves in situations where on this rescue mission, they they there really were life and death decisions presented to us. Are we human first? Or are we filmmakers first? And we chose over and over again to try to be human first. So I wasn't willing to sit there and film someone drown if I could set the camera down and help pull them out of the ocean. And that happened to us over and over again because we were successful in gaining access to the rescue mission itself, where we were just another crew member, which means that our primary task hypothetically was to document whatever unfolded, but it was understood and discussed explicitly with the captain of the boat and the head of mission that if our hands were needed for other purposes, they would be used for other purposes. And so that's the principle that we created the film around. And I think it does find its way into the DNA of the film, right? I think that's why you feel like you're at the center of the action because we were also pulling people out of the ocean, not just film.
Right. And I mean, just to describe a little bit what happens in the film, this was in like 2016 or
Yeah, we
around there.
filmed it in 2016. Yeah.
Yeah, 2016. So there were these huge, what are they even called? Those kind of boats. What are they called? Actually, they're not really lifeboats as such. Well, maybe they are like industrial sized lifeboats that are the kind
Raft.
that would,
Yeah,
yeah,
huge,
more
huge.
like a raft. Yeah,
Yeah,
more like a raft. That's
they can
right.
carry
Um,
up to 130 people sometimes if you stuff them in like sardines, like they did.
and sometimes it looked like even more than that. I mean, they
Yeah.
were clearly overloaded, and these are like totally desperate fellow humans, mostly Africans, that were trying desperately to reach Southern Europe, Italy, or Greece, or Malta. So, how far off the shore were you? Were most of them taking off from Libya? Is that right?
Yeah, yes, most of them take off from the coast of Libya, some of them from Tunisia. Zarzas, is it Zarzas? I'm blanking the name of the island now. But they're taking off from this island on the coast of Tunisia, close to the border with Libya. And there's a couple of different primary beaches where they take off from. And it's a very interesting tension in terms of how that takes place to this day. And it's interesting tension that I think you'll appreciate in terms of how the global community has dealt with that politically as well. When we shot Lifeboat, there was the sort of very robust dialogue between the open borders folks and the more right-wing figures in Europe was just beginning then, right? It hadn't really built to up much of a head of steam yet. And so the rescue operations that were at working in the region as sea watches who we were working with, they kind of had free reign to be able to patrol these areas that were most in need. Because the EU orgs which were tasked with doing that weren't doing it properly, frankly. And so a lot of people were drowning because of it. But the dynamic was such that Libya as a failed nation, let's just say it as it is, the remnants of their Coast Guard weren't really a Coast Guard at all. The remnants of their Coast Guard really had become sort of a militia trafficking organization as much as anything else. And so what would happen is that traffickers on the coast of Libya and Tunisia, right, would sort of had these huge holding areas where they would bring the migrants, right, that oftentimes had been, as soon as they crossed into the border, would then be trafficked, right? So of their own free will and volition, often would find their way to the border of Libya because they knew that's where the boats were taken. And then the Libyan traffickers would grab them off the streets, literally, and put them in often what were former resorts as holding cells. And then only once they receive a certain amount of money from relatives via Western Union and other apps like that, they would be allowed even to be released from these holding areas to get on these incredibly rickety and not very seaworthy crafts, right? So they were actually trafficked often during the course of them trying to seek a better life. And then they're put on these overpacked rafts, right? And basically, there's a tank of fuel and there's an overstuffed raft, sometimes a wooden boat, a fishing boat that's been refurbed. And then, the traffickers don't even get on the boats most of the time. And they tell one of the migrants slash asylum seekers, hey, here's a compass, right? Here's your heading, and they steer it towards Lampedusa, right? With no seafaring knowledge whatsoever. So oftentimes the engines would fail. Oftentimes they'd make it, 20 miles, 30 miles off the coast. And remember, this is an asylum seeker pushing a boat, usually with a single engine, right? Outboard engine in a direction with a magnetic compass. And so any weather, any other contingencies that came into play on that would be bad news for these groups. And so often they'd start to sink. And so that's where Sea-Watch and other orgs like them would intervene. So in our case, there had been a cohort of these rafts in good weather that had been pushed off from the coast of Libya. And we were the only vessel in the area. And there were, I don't recall the exact number, between 10 and 13 rafts and boats at dawn, about 30 miles off the coast of Libya. And we were the only vessel, 30 meters long there to do anything.
Jeez. And I mean, people often think that the Mediterranean doesn't get rough. The Mediterranean gets extremely rough. I mean, as rough as any ocean, really. And if it's a bad day in the middle of the Mediterranean, it's bad. And, also remember, for a lot of these people, it was probably the first time they ever saw an open body of water, the first time they've ever been on a boat, and they can't swim. So on top of everything else, they have all of those complicating factors. And if they would fall in and not grab onto the boat, they're gone forever, like in the vast majority of cases. And, it's so moving, that film, because of the immense human suffering involved. And so, you made so many valid points. What was Libya before it became a failed state? Well, it was a dictatorship, to go back to the beginning theme. And it happens time and time and time again. And I think, part of our role as outsiders, the fortunate, lucky outsiders, is to warn the world when we know about something that's happened repeatedly and we see it happening again, And Libya was a very, very centralized state headed by Muammar Gaddafi, who died a totally brutal death, the death that actually terrifies, I believe, all dictators on planet Earth today. Nobody wants to die the death that Gaddafi experienced. You can look it up online, everybody. It was absolutely brutal. After running that country with an iron fist for 30 plus years. And this is what always happens again. History repeats itself. Dictatorships emerge, and then you get these kind of situations and conditions which lead ultimately to rickety rafts taking off from the shoreline or an offshore island full of people who are so desperate because their own conditions in their own countries were so bad that they felt it was, the best option was to somehow leave and somehow flee towards a wealthier area. And also remember that the people that get on these boats or who, are refugees at all in any place in the world, they tend to be the most courageous people, the most educated usually, the people with the most guts. Most people don't even try because the terror associated with becoming a refugee is overwhelming for most people. They can't even imagine it, as bad as their local conditions are. But it again ties back again to the world citizenship theme. People are only refugees, no matter how you want to define that term, whether legally or, just in social terms. People who flee their countries due to circumstances beyond their control. They're refugees because the state and by inference, the international community has failed them. It has not allowed the emergence of democracy, the emergence of human rights, the emergence of social justice to come into being enough that people want to stay. And most people, most places don't want to leave. This is another complete misnomer by those on the right wing that think, we're going to be swamped by this or that group. The vast majority of humans do not want to leave at all the place where they're from. Their ancestors are buried there. They're familiar with the culture and the language, and they have a job, and they have a house, and they have a tradition, and all this stuff. The overwhelming majority, and that's why only, 4 or 5% maximum of the human race live outside their country of birth. And it's never been easier to travel. It may seem hard, but it's never been easier to leave a country and to settle somewhere else than now. If you have a little bit of money, it can be done. But more and more countries are making it harder and harder. But, again, congratulations on that film, because it was absolutely extraordinary. And you did get an Oscar nomination for it, which is also something to be pretty proud about. And it was well deserved. Then, just to move on from...
Still in the New Yorker, so you can still see it.
Oh, good. I hope so. Well, the other film that you got an Oscar nomination for was Hunger Ward, which you did after Lifeboat, which you filmed in Yemen, again, which I have to say I've watched many times. And, I mean, I've turned on a lot of people to it. I don't think there's this, it's so moving. I mean, as moving as Lifeboat is, Hunger Ward's even more moving, in my humble opinion. It is just so brutal, the human suffering that you capture on film, in the most respectful way, in the most brutal conditions possible, of an actual ward of a hospital that's dedicated exclusively to providing nourishment to starving children. I didn't even know such wards existed in the world, actually, before I saw that film. But as we know, Yemen has been in the news quite a lot lately. There's a lot of conflict which has been going on there for a very long period of time. There's a lot of involvement by the Houthi population and supporters who, are arch enemies of Israel and all of that kind of stuff, and who routinely fire missiles up there, and Israel strikes back. There's a lot of instability, also in a country with an ancient history, incredibly sophisticated culture, and yet it is on the verge, if not already, also effectively yet another failed state for all intents and purposes. So tell us a little bit about Hunger Ward. How did you get the idea to do that film, and how did you learn about that nourishment ward and on?
Before we jump into the film, I want to point something out that I think is apropos here, and that's that regarding the failed state piece. As someone who I've filmed in Yemen twice now. Hunger Ward was the first time, and there's this notion that I think it's easy to buy into if you're just learning about the country through traditional media sources, right? Whether they're left wing, right wing, or independent, that the Houthis, right, or that the country writ large is a failed state. And I have to say that my experience in the country has been very eye-opening, in the sense that when we worked in both areas. In the south of the country, which is the the externally recognized government, let's say, that is a failed state, right? And when we went, we had to get permission to the south as well as to the north, which are very different parallel processes.
Just to clarify, what percent of the territory is controlled by the Houthis now?
Well, it's not a fixed number, right?
But approximately like a third,
Yeah,
roughly?
no, more than that, far more than
Oh,
that.
all right.
I would say well over half. Yeah.
And the numbers of population, is it also more than half, or?
Yes. Yeah.
Uh-huh. All right. Okay. And
So
but they are classified as a terrorist entity, are they not? Under...
currently, they were declassified during the Biden
Oh, really? They were declassified during
tenure.
Biden. Okay.
Yeah, I think that's when they were declassified, and then they were reclassified as a terrorist organization recently, of course, for political reasons, I believe. But our experience, as an American team working there, was that in the South, which is the globally recognized government, it's a completely failed state. right? Militias and warlords run everything. There's something called the Southern Transitional Council, which has a ring of security around the southern city of Aden, right? But then outside of that ring, which is UAE supported, which should tell you a lot if you know anything about global security and politics in the region, it's a mess. Saudi has its hands throughout the South, mostly for resources and land grabs. UAE has grabbed the island of Socotra, right? Saudi Arabia is going after oil in lots of different areas. And then the warlords really run things outside of that, the STC area around Aden. So at any moment, you feel like, something could happen. And, huge guns are everywhere. Everyone's packing large caliber weapons. And it's not safe. It's banditry, it's warlords, it's kidnappings for money, it's terror, it's torture. It's a very tricky way to operate, and that's where we work for about half of the time. In the north, which are controlled by the Houthis. The Houthi, I no longer call them the Houthi rebel group because to me, in my mind, in my experience and colleagues' experiences, they are really a de facto government, right? They are the only institution in that in that national footprint of the traditional Yemeni territory that is offering any government resources to its people. It's the Houthis. So, they tick all the boxes of what governments do for their people. Border security, providing services, water, garbage collection, everything else.
Traffic
And
control, right?
yeah,
Hmm.
exactly.
Hmm.
None of that happens in the South, right? So there's this irony inherent in that the globally recognized government really is a failed state, right? I say that publicly and openly because that's my belief, having been there more than once. And the North really is, I mean, they're the ones who should be globally recognized because they're providing services to their governments. Now, does everyone in the North love the Houthis? Absolutely not, right? But they are functioning as a state. And I think we need to recognize and state that pretty clearly. Now, recently, of course, they've been in the news because they work in solidarity with Palestine, right? And they believe that Palestinians are being butchered in a genocide, and that's why they've been firing missiles, into the Red Sea to say we're in solidarity. Now, have they been framed as such in the media? No, not at all. They're being framed as terrorists, and despite all their challenges as an organization, I think they've been mischaracterized most of the time.
Well, let's also remember that Ireland and Spain are also acting in complete solidarity with the Palestinians as well as most of the rest of the world, really. So this is the majority view is common to what the Houthis also believe vis-a-vis Palestine. So they're not at all an exception.
But if you're an American, right? Back to some of our earlier riffs here. If you're an American and you haven't traveled widely and you haven't been to Yemen like most Americans haven't, and you haven't studied some of those political dynamics in the region, how would you know, Scott? How would you I mean, if you're just getting your news from even CNBC or ABC or Fox, certainly, right? You're going to think that the Houthis are just a terrorist organization that should be bombed to smithereens. But
As
I
you
don't
would think,
believe.
as you would think, the
But
second you heard the word Palestinian in the
right,
United
but
States,
when I
you know.
see those missiles go flying into Sana'a, the capital of the north, I'm on WhatsApp checking in with Fuad, my good friend who I worked with there, saying, "Are you okay?" Because Fuad is a beautiful human being, right? Who tries to help people each and every day of his life, who helped us immensely each day we were there, and who continues to try to help people, including Makia Maji, the nurse practitioner who we showcase in the film, who works with SAMS patients, severe acute malnutrition, pediatric patients who are dying of starvation because supplies can't get in the country, right? And they can't get in the country because they've been designated a terrorist organization and because Saudi Arabia and the US and other countries have put a blockade over the major port and the airport. And Israel recently bombed the airport. So children are dying because of that. And she works to feed those children Anyway.
That woman should win a Nobel Prize at some point in time, because I mean it is so extraordinary, the life that she leads trying to help those children in the hospital that you portray so well, in that film. And it's really it's I mean, this film is part of a what it shows is part of a really degeneration of civilization as it stands. That we in this uber modern age, we still don't have the political wherewithal as a species of humans with self-reflective consciousness, that we have institutions in place that totally prevent these things from happening. I mean, it's outrageous that starvation is now being used openly, live streamed as a tool of war in more than one place
Yeah,
on this planet.
exactly. Yeah.
And a growing number. And each time that the regime that's imposing these despicable measures, these war crimes, crimes against humanity, against innocent civilians, it just makes it that much easier for the next evil regime to do the very same thing. And this is so unacceptable. It's beyond words to be able to even describe it. But maybe describe a few scenes from the film just to give people an impression of what's going on in this very dilapidated hospital that was probably built during the colonial period. Very, very drab and simple, with not anywhere near adequate supplies. And these doctors and nurses are trying their best to keep these children alive.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many scenes, right? That I could lay out, but just to create an image in people's minds, like there's a swinging metal bucket, which I'm sure you've seen, in other places in the world, and it's a tripod of ropes coming down from a frame, and then there's a plastic bucket, right? Usually blue or yellow or pink, right? And one of our first days in the northern clinic with Makia Maji, this little girl, a beer, came in. And a beer was 6 or 7. I'm forgetting whether she was 6. I think she was on the cusp of being 7 when she came in. And one of the first things they did was they wanted to weigh her because she was suffering from starvation, frankly. And so they, one of the assistants to Makia picked up this little beautiful little girl and places her in this weighing basket, right? And I'll never forget looking up to the dial to see how much this 6-year-old girl weighed, and it was 15 pounds. And to see a girl of that age weigh 15 pounds, it breaks your heart, right?
I mean,
Because
that's like 6 kilograms,
yeah, yeah.
Unbelievable.
And so those images are rife and they live in my mind to this day, and more importantly maybe into my heart to this day, because those images are hard to let go of, and when you see them firsthand you see hunger in a different way, right? It makes me think back to, you're gonna laugh at this, but it makes me think back to this fortune cookie I broke open once, Scott, and I love this, but I've held on to it over the years, and it said, "I hear and I forget, I see and I remember, I do and I understand." So to me, that there's a lot of truth in that fortune cookie, right? Within the arena of cinema, obviously, I do believe that images, you tend to remember them more than something you hear, right? But there's also this other piece of it about the firsthand experience, right? If you do something beyond just seeing it, you understand it in a different way. And again, this style of filmmaking involves some doing as well. And so that's what I try to do in films like this, is first not just hear about these things, right? Secondhand, third hand, but really to be there with a primacy so that you can't forget what you see, but also because we're involved in whatever the crisis is as well, to understand it in a different way as well, because we're so close.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, we've both seen a real lot in the world in terms of human suffering, but really the images that come out in that film are just so so overwhelming, but so true. That's what's happening, and that's why it's so important to have films like this to show people and hope that it results in changes in policy and that we're dealing with real lives of real people, which is so often forgotten. I mean, every single one of those lives that you show in that film that, you know, are engaged in so much human misery are just as valuable as any other life. And that's what we so often forget in international affairs. The bombing of Iran last week, the bombing of Israel, the bombing of everywhere. Those are real people with families and lives and washing machines and refrigerators and cars and all the things that you have in your life wherever you are. And the very same thing, if it happened to you, would just be like devastating beyond belief. And that's why, independent voices have to keep harping on about these things. These are the results of human decisions about other humans' lives that result in human suffering. It's as simple as that. And we're getting to the point, again, 80 years after the UN Charter, where this system of international governance that we were meant to have, which could end war for all time and guarantee human rights for everyone, very laudable, very reasonable goals, are slowly and surely being chipped away at every single time an individual government official or a regime gets away with imposing suffering on others.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
mhm.
No, no, I was just going to riff on that a little bit. I think, I think as much as we share so many lived experiences and so many value sets, I sense there's a way that our brains work very different. And I want to, and I think one of those ways, because I have a friend who I think whose brain functions differently too. So one of the things I struggle with in my work and career, Scott, is that, if you've had all these experiences and you understand sort of some of these global connections and you've seen this suffering in the world throughout the world, right? I think it's really easy to be crushed by that or begin to be hopeless over time, right? We have to sort of fight it, especially in our current political climate, right? And I think that's a danger. That's an inherent danger in working in these arenas on a global scale. I know it is for me. And so what I've come to over the years is because that is a force at play when you see how these regimes function and how it affects real people's lives. Is I always think of, well, how do you fight against that? How do you push back against that? And people do it in different ways, right? People start foundations, they do podcasts, they write books, they make films, right? But what I've come to over the years is I call it the long tail of documentary film, for me at least, right? And what that means is that when I do a film like Hunger Ward, right, I sort of have an internal commitment to continue the relationships in sort of a bespoke fashion, whatever makes sense for those relationships that is possible, right? And at the risk of virtue signaling, the way that we did it with Hunger Ward is that those needs for Makia Maji in the north and Aida Al Sadiq at Sadaka Hospital in the south continue to this day because the political dynamic hasn't been resolved in the country yet. So those children are still starving. And because of that, because we had some success with the film, we were able to raise funds and continue to raise funds to this day to support those women's work fighting starvation in their country. And that's what makes it okay for me not be crushed by hope, right? Because I can see that we can affect this individual girl's life or this individual infant's life or this young boy's life through the work of these extraordinary human beings who haven't been crushed by hopelessness either. And I think they haven't been crushed by it because they can change this one human being's life. And that gives them hope and it gives me hope. And so I have to look at the concrete, specific, and individual in order to continue to move on. Because if I look at the collective global like moment, the potential to be crushed by it exists for sure.
Well, no doubt about it. I'm still a believer, despite all this suffering, despite all this hardship, despite all this awfulness. Most people, most places, most of the time are actually pretty okay, you know, and pretty kind and pretty nice and pretty friendly and pretty understanding and generous above all else. And it's a small number that create the overwhelming amount of suffering and misery. I mean, if we look at the situation in your country,
No,
United
stop,
States.
stop, stop. I have to intervene. Okay. Your top four evil human beings in the world. Go.
Whatever,
Who are,
ever in the history of
no,
humanity,
who are
or
alive today. Who are alive today. Now, you may be shot after this, or poison may be injected into your drinking water, but if you want to take this as a courageous moment.
well, I would say like let one of them has to be a composite of the human race, right? It's a composite of the human race who does nothing,
Oh,
you know,
interesting. Oh, that's fascinating.
you
Yeah.
know, which is probably the overwhelming majority of the species. So there's of course a segment that is so evil that it totally believes that itself as an individual or a country is somehow inherently better than all the others and is willing to give the biggest middle finger to the entire world in order to prove that, right? So that's one category. But the biggest category of all is probably humans that have at least heard about these problems across the world that actively choose to do nothing, right? And I mean, in the end, I believe, that we have the numbers, so to speak. People that believe in human rights, people that really are compassionate at the core of their being, are the majority. The clear, overwhelming majority of people are like that. The willingness to cooperate peacefully is much larger as a sentiment than the belief that you win everything through pure strength, pure raw power, pure middle finger to you. I'm going to win at all costs. And yet the system that we've allowed to develop, the political systems, even the very idea of nation states, facilitates the emergence of the very worst people to the top of the pyramid of power. By its very nature, if you have a piece of territory that you yourself can control as one individual, tell the rest of the world not to enter, do whatever the hell you want inside of it, and give a middle finger to the rest of the world who says, hey, what about that racial group, and what about that gender group, and what about that group and that group? Well, that's pretty evil, right? So, it's hard, that's like saying where are human rights violations the absolute worst? It's very hard to, come up with a list, but part of just take the abolition or the abandonment of USAID as a policy. The United States Agency for International Development. This is the most conservative of all of the aid agencies in the world. The percent of money that they spent as a portion of national income is one of the smallest of any of the development agencies in the world. Average Americans, when asked on the street, how much does the United States pay for so-called global development or humanitarian aid, most people say 20% of GDP. The real number is 0.2% max. It's a tiny proportion, and yet they even wiped out that bit, right? So there is a direct line that can be drawn between abolishing, as limited as USAID's actual percentage role was, by killing it and killing all the billions of dollars in its budget. There's a direct line you can draw between that and the deaths of real human beings. There's a website, I think it's the University of Boston University. You can look it up, which is calculating on a minute-by-minute updated basis the amount of people dead in the world because of shutting down the programs associated with USAID. Now, that's pretty evil, if you ask me. There's a clear, direct, consequential line that you can draw. That's just death by, omission, in other words, ending programs that were saving lives, which are going to kill people. That's pretty evil. Bombing countries contrary to international law, no matter who does it, pretty evil. Randomly plucking people off the street, notwithstanding any other criteria, largely because of the color of their skin, and putting them into unmarked vans by masked men and sending them to countries which are not even their own country through a deportation process, after interning them in camps which are as bad as one could imagine, that's pretty evil. And the list goes on. So I don't know. I mean, you can't really say like who is the worst, because it's not always individual leaders that are the worst, right? It's the enablers.
Sometimes it is. Sometimes it is.
Sometimes it is, but there's all these enablers behind the scenes that you don't know that might have a much higher proportion of power than you think, but the figurehead is there, but there's these enablers underneath that do it. One of the things that's super interesting, I think, about how, obviously a democratically elected leader who is truly interested in protecting his people or her people and the rest of the world is not going to end up on the top of the evil person list. But one really important point to make is that anyone who does end up on that list is probably going to be a dictator or a dictator wannabe, right? But as has always been spoken about when you think about countries converting from dictatorship back into democracy or democracy for the first time, there's all these common themes, right? One is that you have to get the civil service of that country on your side. It's all about that. So if you look at North Korea, yeah, Kim Jong-un, he runs everything, of course, right? He's the final arbiter on what goes. But there's 2 million civil servants that are paid well, who have apartments to live in, who have some freedom to do this or that, who have some income, some guaranteed job, some privileges, adequate food, etc., right? Those are the people that really matter in the end. They allow the regime to continue on, they prop it up, but also, unless they change, the system's not going to change. And if you look at what happened in Eastern Europe following 1989, it was all the civil servants switched sides. In Syria, all the civil servants switched sides. In Libya, all the civil servants switched sides. So it's those. To me, kind of, it's even more interesting to think about what holds up evil regimes and allows and enables them. And the other issue that it brings to mind is that, any regime right now that's committing crimes, clearly proven crimes against humanity, crimes against international law, war crimes, indictments being put forth by the International Criminal Court against certain leaders in the world today, arrest warrants, etc. There are clearly crimes taking place. Again, another common theme which comes out in countries which had oppressive regimes, which found democracy again, is this whole idea of truth and reconciliation. Look at Argentina following the general's evil regime from 1976 to 83, where 30,000 people were disappeared, never to be seen or heard from again. They had this whole process of nunca más, never again, this big report that articulated the crimes of that horrible era. And then a lot of people were put on trial, and a lot of people are still in prison today for the crimes that they committed. These very same processes will be carried out in all of the countries which are today dictatorships, in one form or another. There might be a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There might be a big, huge, war crimes tribunal, like in the Nuremberg trials. The list goes on. And this is also something that ordinary people that support dictatorial regimes have to also become aware of, that, I've mentioned this several times on this channel. One of the most overwhelming lessons I learned when I first moved for a long period of time overseas to Germany when I was 19 was encountering all these sad, depressed, elderly women that I would encounter in the forest, walking in groups of 5 or 6, and they wouldn't even say hello, and they were bitter and angry, and and I was trying to make friends with them repeatedly, and they never would, and I was sort of asked around, like, what's wrong here, Why aren't they even speaking? And then people started saying this or that, and it became clear to me that these were basically widows from World War II who were enduring life without their husbands, without their families, who were, totally depressed, severe PTSD because of it. And there was this common phrase that you would hear in Germany all the time: Wir haben das nicht gewusst. Das wussten wir nicht. We didn't know. We didn't know. We didn't know. So they would deceive themselves. They knew, for goodness sakes, what was going on from 1933 to 1945. They knew there were concentration camps. They knew there was fascism. They knew there was dictatorship. And they now, after the fact, said, oh, we didn't know. You can't blame us. We didn't do anything. We didn't know. And that same sentiment is apparent right now in the world in which dictatorship, authoritarian regimes, despotism is occurring, including, unfortunately, in your country. There are many people who will claim down the road that they didn't know. Didn't know that we had our own version of Gestapo. I didn't know that people were being deported at that level. I didn't know that American citizens were being plucked off the street. I didn't know. So in a way, long answer. It's kind of that mentality that is really the worst of all, because people do know. They actively choose to do nothing, not to rock the boat, because they don't want to be singled out. And who can blame them in many respects? The life of a human rights activist is not easy. But it's a lot easier. You don't want to lose your job. You don't want to be terrorized. You don't want to be this. You don't want to be that. But we'll talk about that question later. I'll think about the list. So let's just continue on briefly about your next film after Hunger Ward, and congratulations again. Where can people watch? Can people watch Hunger Ward still somewhere?
Yeah, it's on both Paramount Plus and Pluto TV. Pluto TV is free, by the way, so you can find that if you don't have a subscription to Paramount Plus. So yeah, it's still streaming online.
Oh, excellent. Okay. And then was Rue the next major film you made after that?
I made two other films, short films. Speed of Rust, also shot,
of course.
and then American Zeno, and then the most recent one is Chasing Rue, which was just released. Actually, it was just released on Amazon Prime in last week. So
excellent! I didn't know that.
Including Australia, U.S. and Australia and Canada. So now it's online. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was a very different kind of movie to Lifeboat and Hunger Ward. I mean, in a way, it was similar, but obviously the theme was not hunger or refugees, but our poor little Skippy, the kangaroo, and of course the wild feral pig issue in Australia. So just tell people briefly about Rue before we move on to the most recent project.
Chasing Rue is it sort of the seed of that film was planted many years prior, actually when I was in DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, which is in the news a lot nowadays. And maybe this speaks to sort of the global nature of citizenry, but also of my filmmaking, right? So I was shooting a film in for the State Department in DRC, and we were in the east outside of Goma, which M23 has taken over recently. And we stumbled across an abattoir, the largest abattoir in eastern Congo, which is saying something because, it's a very large region. And we were invited in. And so over the course of the next, 30 to 60 minutes or so, we bore witness to what happens in an African abattoir. And I would posit not just an African abattoir, right? In this particular case, we saw the entire process of a line of cows outside, this abattoir, and the bolt gun that they use, where a bolt slides out of the barrel to stun them, seeing the cows fall over, and then, chains being wrapped around their legs, and then being winched up, still alive, semi-conscious, and winched over, right, to have a halal death where they be bled out while still alive. And then I won't go into any more, granular detail, but we then saw how this live animal over the course of about 30 minutes or so exited in about 15 pieces, right? And that had a profound effect on me, and it planted the seed creatively of me wanting to one day engage with this notion of speciesism, this idea that just because we as human beings have this particular brain and these particular hands to make tools with, that we have the right to be ascendant over other species in this particular way. It gives us the right to literally eat their bodies, right? And I wanted to confront that with Chasing Rue. And when I discovered that, the annual cull of kangaroos in Australia is the largest commercial culling of a land-based animal in the world, I thought, what better way to do it than through this lovable icon of Australia, right? Which people think of in a very particular way and alive and well in the animated world. And so I wanted to explore that, but I also wanted to sort of explore sort of that cognitive dissonance between communities that exists in Australia that most people don't know about, where there's a huge cohort of the population that is pro-culling, right? That these small outback communities who have relied upon kangaroos, Aboriginal and otherwise, right, for centuries. And it sustains them, right? It sustains them economically. It sustains them from a caloric standpoint, um, and it's a way of life, frankly. And they value it and they honor it in a really particular way. And then the whole community of those who believe this is barbaric and outdated, and that no one should be killing kangaroos for a profit. And so there was a real cognitive dissonance there for me, and even within those communities. And I wanted to sort of explore both of those ideas and try to do it in a way where I could create empathy for the hunted as well as the hunters themselves. And that was one of the primary goals of the project.
Right. And one of the things that stood out for me watching that, because I mean, kangaroos for me are like as common as whatever, dogs or cats or anything. I mean, I see kangaroos like not every day, but very often. I can go to kangaroos guaranteed 100% any day if I want to. So they're ubiquitous. But there was this one scene which you will remember. Baby kangaroos are called joeys. You remember the scene of the joey, the almost pre-joey?
Yeah,
Almost, fetus size.
I see and I remember, Scott.
Yeah, I can imagine. I can't even believe I asked you that. But that scene, it kind of captured that essence, which is also, prevalent today in modern man, so to speak. You have, a group that would be completely devastated by that imagery. Like, oh my God, how can you do that, to a poor little, kangaroo fetus almost, and treat it so dismissively as if it's really nothing. And then those who are completely overwhelmed, just devastated by it, right? And you kind of have that competing worldview today of like, why should I care about people from that country? They're not from my country. Why should I care about, that religious group? They're not my religious group. And then those who care, like, well, hey, guess what? We're all the same anyway. Don't base your opinion on that. And that really comes through in that film. And, that deals with the classic issues of, local economy, very, not the wealthiest part of Australia, shall we say, who are totally economically reliant on getting rid of what they see essentially as a pest. I mean, there are parts of Australia where there are too many kangaroos, and there's a rationale behind the culling of it, but it's going in directions which are rather out of control. But I think that would be a super eye-opening film, even for Australians who are not that familiar with what's going on in the world of Skippy the kangaroo, the national icon on every tail of every Qantas jet, right? And everywhere else. I mean, this is ultimate. This is the only country where kangaroos exist, right? Marsupial Central, right here. But, that was another amazing film that you made. I think you made the short list for the Oscars on that one. Not quite up to the nomination, but it was also An amazing film, and that's, you said, now available on Amazon Prime, right?
Yeah, just in the last week. Yeah,
Just in the last
it's
week.
on
That's great.
Amazon Prime in Australia and the US and in Canada and a bunch of other countries as well. So they're
Excellent.
still sort of rolling it out at this point.
And what about your main project now? Or at least I hope it's your main project now.
It is. It is. Yeah, well, we're working with Displacement Solutions, which some of your viewers may recognize, to do, I think, what's a pretty groundbreaking feature documentary. It's not a short, sort of about the human impact of climate change induced extreme weather and the displacement that that causes. So we're building it out across the four themes of the four elements in four different locations across the globe. So it's very much a global project, a very highly conceptual project. We're trying to break new ground technically with what we're doing from a cinematography standpoint as well. So it's there's a big sweat equity investment from that standpoint because we're literally building out bespoke tech as part of it for more than one of the shoots, and then there's a huge time investment piece to like get the camera exactly where we want it at exactly the right moment. And so there's you have to be patient, and you have to do a lot of sort of very proactive work technologically first, right? So, you know, along the fire theme, for example, we're trying to place cameras where cameras haven't been before. And I don't want to go into too much detail here, but I'm pretty excited about it because one of the things I try to do in every film that I do is to try to do something I haven't done before and something I haven't seen before. And if we're successful with this project, it's certainly going to be that. So I'm actually on this every single day at this point. Because it's a pretty big project and it's and because it's a feature, it involves a bunch of different locations across the globe as well.
And you don't want to really talk about the locations just yet, right?
Well, we can talk about Nigeria. We shot Nigeria already, so that's easy. We spent 3 weeks shooting in the Niger Delta, and part of that was, you know, I'm not afraid of saying it, to tie the oil industry to climate change, right? Because the Niger Delta has been so impacted for generations, you know, upwards of 7 decades now, by the petroleum industry. Not only by the extractive elements of that, but the impact on the environment and the people as well. That we really wanted to tie sort of the film to that industry explicitly in our own sort of aesthetic way. And so that's why we really studied this element of air in Nigeria where it's been so impacted. So one of the things that's happening in Nigeria and has been hacked for generations is that the big oil companies have ruthlessly chosen to not invest in the um, the uh, the development of natural gas as one of the secondary products from raw crude because it took an extra investment of technology. The technology has been extant forever, right? But it's more of a financial investment to take that byproduct of gross crude and actually use it to create natural gas from. And what they've done instead is they've chosen over the generations now to off flare, right? That part of the gross crude so they don't have to deal with it. So what that means in concrete terms is that there's these huge pipes, right? Both horizontal and vertical coming out of the ground near these plants throughout the Niger Delta, and they're just burning off the natural gas into the atmosphere, into communities, near communities. And it's had all sorts of effects, as you might imagine, because they're putting benzene and all other sorts of noxious gases into the breathable air in these communities. And it's affecting, as you might imagine, those communities, not only from a health standpoint, but from an environmental standpoint. And so we wanted to sort of, in a really visceral, visual fashion, document that and make and sort of build that into the linchpin foundation of why climate change is happening in the first place, right? Which is the human intervention of the burning of carbon. Wow, I'm never going to get another government grant.
Well, it just reminds me. Just yesterday, I'd read this many years ago because obviously I'm working on this film with you, and I've been involved in climate change forever, right? So I've read this years ago, but I'd forgotten about it. Just got a reminder of it yesterday. Edward Teller, I think he was involved in the nuclear development project in New Mexico in the 40s. I think it was 1958 or 56 or something. He was already warning about the consequences of burning fossil fuels and this new thing called climate change, and how the sea levels would rise and how the temperature of the world would go up and so on and so forth in the 50s. And this was widely known to the extraction industries, to governments, to others. We're now in the 2025. This is now almost 70 plus years later, and it still goes on. And every year, the contribution of CO2 into the atmosphere and methane and others just keeps going up. The Paris Agreement of 2015, as great and forward-looking as it is, and indispensable as it is, has not yet resulted in declines in temperature or declines in CO2 emissions. And every single successive month becomes the hottest month ever recorded. And so again, wir haben das nicht gewusst, said the Germans. We didn't know. Well, guess what? Humans know. Humans know right now what's happening and what's going to happen in whatever. It's already, the consequences are already huge. Did you know Australia has a legally binding treaty between itself and Tuvalu, which it just concluded last year, called the Whalatepe Agreement, something like that. It gives Tuvaluans the right to attempt to relocate to Australia, right? They just issued the first sort of offer. 1/3 of the entire national population of Tuvalu applied. It was just announced in the paper yesterday to relocate to Australia now. And Tuvalu is already suffering the consequences, but it's nowhere near as bad as it will be. That's already 1/3 of that individual country has expressed a concrete willingness to move. And they don't want to move. Neither do the people of Ontong Java, neither do the people of Bangladesh, neither do the people of any seaboard in the world. And there's a direct line between the burning of fossil fuels by certain companies that extract it, and by us as consumers as well, that are creating conditions which are totally known, and yet we don't do anything about it. And so it's really, it's kind of back to the world citizenship theme, and I think we'll just kind of end it soon here. It's really the battle between those who believe in the whole, as in WHOLE, and those who believe in the HOLE, and either you want the planet to survive and believe our species is beautiful and wonderful enough that it's worth preserving as one whole, 8.2 billion of us, or there's those of you who think we should just throw it all in some dirty old hole and just party on until we can party no more, and that was that. And it is kind of this existential battle between those two forces at play. And hopefully your latest film, your new film, which will be out, I believe, is it still March 2026 target? Or
not put a date on it at this point, Scott. Why put a date on these things, right?
In the future.
But I do want to do a shout out to you specifically, because you've been a huge part of making this project a reality. It aligns with your belief system, and displacement solutions has been, the executive producer on the project, and that's enabled it. So thank you for that.
My pleasure. Well, thank you. And it's so great working with you on this project, and hopefully it'll be the first of many to come. Maybe one on world citizenship down the road, hopefully.
I have an idea how to close this out if you're open to it.
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah. If I may, I want to read something that the captain of Lifeboat, John Castle, shall live on in beautiful memory for me forever. but he was the captain of the boat, and it's a quote that we use from him um, in the body of the film, and I think you understand why I want to share it once I do. So this is directly from the film. He said, "The further away from a problem with humans you are, the easier it is to rationalize and just see them as a problem. The closer you are to a problem, like a car crash or something, then it's not just a mess of people, but you're separating into individuals, and they all have different expressions on their faces. And then you have to start dealing with them like people. Then your heart starts operating more than your head, and your heart tells the truth when you listen to it. I'm sure one more turn of the historical cycle, and we'll be the poor countries, and we'll be the hordes of unemployed people, not wanted, not cared about, the riffraff. We could be those people. And in the end, we have to remember that those are our fellows."
Well, that's pretty profound. It, by the way, reminds me of a brand new series which I just watched from start to finish on SBS On Demand. I don't know if you'll be able to get that in the United States, but certainly in Australia, it's the best TV station here. They have an ad, by the way, apropos totally of what we've been talking about. I just saw this huge billboard driving to Melbourne yesterday. It says, for those of you, in huge billboard, bright yellow and black, for those of you who care about the other 192 countries in the world. So good. You wouldn't see that in America these days. Anyway, there's a Danish series on there, which you would really like if you haven't seen it already. It's called Families Like Us. Have you heard about it?
No, I haven't.
It's exactly what that quote just pointed out.
Okay.
That it's about Denmark chooses, the political establishment of Denmark decides to shut the country down.
Oh, interesting.
Said, sorry, folks, it's really painful, but we're going to have to shut Denmark down because we can't stop the water from rising anymore. Okay?
That's hilarious.
They make a political decision.
Yeah.
The king announces it on television. And then this whole series, 7 episodes, I think, is about, from, 8 or 10 different people's perspectives of what they do. What's already going on in many countries across the world, that choice process. But the interesting twist in this one, and it doesn't really give it away, is that you would think, because Denmark, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 8th richest country in the world, incredibly prosperous, incredibly progressive, great people, guess what? Nobody wants to let the Danes in anymore. You see, that's the interesting twist. And exactly as you just said, when you allow misery to occur or facilitate it across the world, be aware that just as easily could be you, even in one, unless you prevent it from happening again. And if it's not you, then guess what? The guy that cooked your meal at that nice restaurant could be his family. The woman that cleaned your house yesterday could be her family.
That's
the person
right.
you sit next to on the bus could be her family.
Yep.
And the list goes on. So, the bottom line is, let's end it on this. That's a good precursor to the actual ending, which is, it's very unusual for a lot of people, particularly in the United States, in much of the Western world, to hear people proclaim themselves to be world citizens. There's even a sort of instant, ew, what's that? That sounds like some horrible totalitarian 1984 kind of term, So it has nothing to do with 1984 or totalitarianism. To me, it means we're all in this together. We're all on the same planet. We should all care about each other and try to build a society in which everyone's rights are respected. And if we can do that in a way where we all participate democratically in a system that affects us all and helps us all, then all the better. So just to end it today, what does it mean to you if you were to say, I'm a world citizen because?
Wasn't expecting that. I'm a world citizen because I believe we share universal wants, needs, and desires. That we're all fundamentally the same, no matter our religious beliefs, color of skin, sexual orientation. Fundamentally, we all have the same needs and wants. That's what I believe.
Yeah, well, that's about as true as it comes. So let's end it there. So thank you so much, Skye Fitzgerald, documentary filmmaker extraordinaire, and my friend. And that was Democracy Tomorrow for today. We'll be back tomorrow with the next episode. Please subscribe if you like what we're offering. Please do a little like, do all those things that you have to do on YouTube in order to get further. We hope you enjoyed today. Thank you again, Skye, and we'll see you next time, Democracy Tomorrow. Take care, everybody.
Thanks, Scott.